Chapter 244 Death Zone. This high into the foothills of the mountains, they didn't have to look long for a suitable shelter. In fact, they could have simply camped in the open. The dark sea couldn't get to them anymore. As the night descended and enveloped the world in the familiar veil of absolute darkness, Sunny volunteered to be the first one to stand watch. Gazing down to the sloping surface of the rocky ground, he watched as the black water slowly rose from the distant crimson forest of the labyrinth. It crawled up the steep slope of the foothills, straining to devour as much of them as it could, but then stopped hundreds of meters away from the place where the cohort had made their camp and swayed gently, unable to move any further. Just like the headless colossus had not been able to. Looking at the powerless waves, Sunny finally allowed himself to believe that they were now outside of the forgotten shore, or, more precisely, at the very edge of it. In any case, the cursed sea was no longer a threat to them. How strange. Sunny had grown accustomed to living in the constant fear of this transient abyss. Even in the dark city, he was constantly aware of its oppressive presence. No one was free of the frightening thoughts about what would happen if the seemingly unassailable wall of the city finally gave in and fell, opening the way to the flood of darkness. But now, they were safe from it. For now. With a sigh, Sunny summoned the Blood Blossom. An intricate pendant in the shape of a beautiful red flower soon appeared, hanging on the black thread around his neck. He admired it for a few short moments, and then hid the charm under his armor. It was better to be safe than sorry. Relaxing now was not the brightest of ideas. Yes, the dangers of the dark sea were now behind them, but he was ready to bet that actually escaping the clutches of the forgotten shore was not going to be that easy. And who said that this place beyond this desolate hell was any better? With his luck, it was only going to be worse. Consumed in thought, Sunny stared at the dark sea and waited. In the morning, the members of the cohort prepared to start the search. But before they could get to it, Nephis suddenly stopped them and peered at the towering peaks that loomed above in a veil of mist. There was a dark expression on her face. After a while, Changing Star suddenly kneeled and picked up a large rock. Straining her muscles, she crushed it in her fist and then looked at the shards with an inquisitive look. Finally, she threw the shattered pieces away and sighed. A few seconds later, Nephis spoke in a heavy tone. I know where we are. What was that supposed to mean? Echoing his thought, Effie scoffed. We all know where we are, Princess. The southern edge of the Forgotten Shore, about 2,000 kilometers away from the Dark City. No? Nephis shook her head and stood up. I mean, I know where we are in the Dream Realm. Everyone froze. What did you just say? The members of the cohort stared at her with their eyes open wide. The words Changing Star had said hit them like a bolt of lightning. She pointed at the draconian peaks and said, her voice even, We are north of the Hollow Mountains. I am sure of it. Hollow Mountains? The name rang a bell, but Sunny couldn't quite put his finger on where exactly he had heard it. Glancing at the other members of the cohort, he noticed that everyone shared the same expression, except for Castor, who seemed to know something. His face grew pale. Nephis lingered for a few moments, and then explained. Human sphere of influence in the Dream Realm is not very large, but it has been slowly expanding for the last 30 years. There are 3 great citadels, the most prosperous of which, Bastion, is ruled by the noble scions of the Valor clan, and numerous lesser ones. Then she grimaced. For a time, the allies and vassals of Clan Valor used to conquer one lesser citadel after another, expanding human territory far into the north. But then their expansion in that direction stalled, because they encountered hollow mountains. Oh, right. I think I heard that from Teacher Julius. The northern border of the human territory is a wild place. Sunny frowned. Are these hollow mountains very dangerous? Changing Star gritted her teeth. As dangerous as it gets. Actually, beyond that. The mountain chain stretches for thousands of kilometers, forming a whole region of its own. It is marked as a death zone. Even saints don't come back from there alive. Sunny shivered. Death zones were regions of the dream realm populated by nightmare creatures of the three highest ranks: great, cursed, and unholy. Since no human had survived the fourth nightmare yet, facing even the weakest of them was a death sentence to anyone below the saint rank, and even saints had only a slight chance of prevailing against a great creature, let alone a cursed one. Somehow, Sunny managed to become one of the few people alive to slay a great devil. But he had only survived that encounter by pure luck. If not for his weird trait of possessing a shadow core instead of a soul core, the unborn spawn of the vile, thieving bird would have stolen his life force and killed him on the spot. And if Nephis was right, the Hollow Mountains were populated by many creatures of that caliber and higher. Sunny sighed. So what you're telling us is that this place is even worse than the Forgotten Shore? Without having to say anything, Nephis simply nodded. He smiled. Figures. He had been right after all. Escaping the Forgotten Shore was simply impossible. The only way out lay in the cursed Crimson Spire, and that was where they were headed, whether he wanted to or not. With a dark expression on his face, Sunny stared at the jagged peaks of the Hollow Mountains and said, So, we are going there? Nephis lingered for a few moments, and then answered calmly, Let's hope not. We only need to get as far as the First Lord had gotten, and that should be close to where we are right now. Sunny looked at her and nodded. In that case, let's not waste any time. The sooner we return into the labyrinth, the better. Gee, I never thought I would be impatient to return to that damned hellhole. You just never know what the future holds, huh? Chapter 245 Theater of Giants. Armed with the understanding of just how dangerous the beautiful mountains towering above them were, the cohort set out deeper into the foothills. Because they didn't know much about the area and what type of creatures populated it, they decided to stay together. While it would have been much easier to send Kai to take a look around from above, no one wanted to take this risk. As the result, the 6 humans moved in a tight group, much like they had on the narrow streets of the Dark City and in the labyrinth. However, the landscape around them was vastly different. There were no growths of crimson coral covering the ground, just grass and outcroppings of gray rock. It almost felt like they were back on Earth. Strangely, that made Sunny feel uncomfortable. Looking around, he could see far in every direction, with no walls of coral or ancient ruined buildings obscuring his view. That made it harder for the nightmare creatures to ambush the cohort, but also impossible for the cohort to hide from anything that could have been watching. That is true, but where are all the monsters? Indeed, no matter how hard Sunny looked, he couldn't see any movement whatsoever. It was as if the entire area was completely dead. They were surrounded by complete silence, which was broken only when a member of the cohort made a sound. The picturesque scenery could have been peaceful, but felt eerie instead. Even Sunny's shadow seemed uncharacteristically listless. Full of unease, they continued to move forward. The plan was very simple. Because of Cassie's vision, they knew that the First Lord and his companions had traveled to the mountains the same way that they did, or at least followed the same route. That meant that both cohorts entered the foothills at approximately the same spot. The other thing Cassie had told them was that they were searching for a vast pit in the stone. It was hard to miss something like that, so all they had to do was move deeper into the foothills and look around. The ground beneath their feet gently sloped upwards. As time passed, it grew more and more rocky, and the incline became rather steep. Soon they were surrounded by tall boulders and had to walk on bare stone. At some point, Sunny looked back and was surprised to realize how high above the labyrinth they had climbed. By now, it was far away and below them, looking like a vast crimson sea. A strange sensation settled in his heart. With a bit of introspection, Sunny realized that it was something he had lost a long time ago. The feeling of being connected to the rest of humanity. Even though all of them understood that crossing the Hollow Mountains was an impossible task, simply knowing where they were in relation to the rest of the Awakened made all the difference. They might have been just as stranded as they had been before, but at least they weren't lost anymore. What a nice but useless thought. With a sigh, he turned around and hurried to catch up with the rest of the cohort. The sun was still high in the sky when they found the pit Cassie had described. It was situated in a valley just at the point where the foothills turned into proper mountains, and turned out to be something different from what everyone had imagined. Disturbingly, throughout the whole day, they had not met a single living being. In any other circumstances, Sunny would have been glad because of this strange lack of nightmare creatures, but now it was just making him nervous. Standing at the edge of it, he looked down with a feeling of awe. Cut into the flesh of the mountains, a vast quarry lay below them. Despite its incredible scale, it was clearly made by humans. A road clinging to the slope of the circular pit led to the bottom of it, wide enough for 10 carriages to ride side by side. At the far end of the quarry, the gray slope of the mountain was cut and hollowed, creating something that resembled either colossal steps or seats of an amphitheater built for giants. Here and there, massive blocks of stone stood, as though ready to be transported back to the ancient city. Sunny studied the monolithic blocks of gray stone, then the size of the deep quarry. Something connected in his mind. So this is where the materials for the mighty wall of the Dark City had come from. He was certain of it. To think that the ancient inhabitants of the Forgotten Shore had transported all that stone from this far away. The thought of it was nothing short of humbling. Effie, meanwhile, was staring at something with a tense look on her face. Suddenly, she pointed to the center of the deep quarry and said, "Over there, look." Following her gaze, Sunny strained his eyes. For a couple of moments, he couldn't understand what the huntress was talking about, but then his heart skipped a beat. At the bottom of the quarry, there was a giant nightmare creature. The abomination was enormous, easily twice the size of the carapace demon, who had already been as tall as a house. It looked like a strange insect, somewhat resembling a weird mix of a rhinoceros beetle and a praying mantis, with a smooth carapace, massive horn, and deadly blades attached to the joint of its limbs. The whole creature seemed to be made out of stone, and was the same color as the floor of the quarry. In fact, if not for Effie's warning, Sunny might not have noticed it. That flesh, however, was broken and shattered, lying in piles on the ground. The giant stone demon was dead, and from the looks of it, it died by a human hand. Sunny turned to Nephis and hesitated for a moment. "What do you think? Those are sword cuts, aren't they?" Changing Star was silent for a bit, and then said in a dark tone, "It's hard to tell. We'll need to get closer to take a proper look. Chapter 246. Irrefutable Proof. Ready for the worst, the cohort summoned their weapons and slowly moved down the wide road that led to the bottom of the quarry. From reaching the foothills of the Hollow Mountains till now, they had not met a single nightmare creature, but that was not a reason to lower their guard. Walking on the ancient path, all of them couldn't help but steal glances at the corpse of the giant stone demon, as though expecting it to come back to life and attack them at any moment. If living on the Forgotten Shore had taught him anything, it was to always expect the worst. Sometime later, Effie spoke. "See those deep fractures in the floor of the quarry? I think that this thing had burrowed from below, so watch your step." Remembering his encounter with the rolling stone, Sonny looked down with a sour expression. That clumsy creature was more funny than dangerous, but only because its teeth were vastly outclassed by the puppeteer's shroud. If something with more bite were to ambush them from below, who knew what was going to happen? With a simple thought, Sonny summoned the Stone Saint and ordered her to keep close. The taciturn monster stared at the tall peaks of the Hollow Mountains for a few moments, as though subtly affected by the sight of them. Then she lowered her head and silently followed his command. After tense and an exhausting half an hour of descending into the deep pit, the cohort finally got close to the remains of the giant stone insect. Cautiously stopping a few dozen meters away from it, they hesitated, not sure how to proceed. Finally, Nephis sighed and walked forward, approaching the shattered body of the dead demon, if that was what it had been, or was. As their leader came close enough to the carcass to touch it with her hand, all of them held their breaths. A few seconds went by, and then a few more. Nothing jumped at Changing Star from below the stones. The giant creature had not moved, nor had it shown any signs of coming back to life. The demon just lay there, its body shattered and broken, terrifying even in death. And it indeed was truly, really dead. Glancing at the indifferent saint, Sonny let out a sigh of relief. Even though he was prepared for a tough battle, he hoped that this time they would be able to avoid it. The members of the cohort had yet to fully recover from the harrowing journey atop the walking colossus, so they weren't in the best of shapes. Well, at least Sonny was not, partially because he had refused Neff's offer to vanquish his wounds with her purifying flame. They were healing fast thanks to the blood weave and the 500 shadow fragments, almost, that he had accumulated, but his body was yet to recover. Turning her head, Neff looked at them and said, "Come closer." Encouraged by her words, the members of the cohort finally put their caution to rest and walked over to the dead creature. Of course, they were still prepared to instantly react in case something unexpected happened. The six of them spent a few minutes studying the remains to determine whether the terrible creature was killed by a human or something of its own kind. Sonny glanced at the tall mountains and spent a few seconds watching as the white mist rolled down from their peaks, flowing down the jagged slopes like a waterfall made of clouds. How beautiful. With a sigh, he turned away from the wall of mist that was still some distance away from the valley where the quarry was situated and concentrated on the corpse of the stone demon. Whatever had killed it was not something Sonny would wish to meet in battle. The flesh of the creature was, indeed, made of stone. That had not stopped the fearsome attackers, however. The carapace of the giant granite abomination was shattered in many places and melted in others. But mostly it was cut and pierced. Apart from a few enormous wounds, There were numerous smaller ones, many of them looking as though they could have come from a sword, an axe, or a spear. And yet, he wasn't sure. Sonny was not really an expert in such things. However, he was an expert in all things having to do with greed and avarice. Instead of focusing on the nature of the damage done to the giant abomination, Sonny walked around and found its abdomen, which was damaged especially severely. With a reluctant sigh, he climbed atop the stone corpse, and then inside of it. The other members of the cohort stared at him with expressions ranging from surprise to revulsion. A couple of minutes later, Sonny climbed out of the dead demon and shook off stone dust from his armor and hair. Then he glanced at his companions and frowned. What? Kai stared at him with a complicated expression, and then asked, Sonny? Do you want to tell us something? Sonny gave him a nod and grinned. I do, actually. This thing was indeed killed by a human. The charming archer raised an eyebrow and asked in a dubious tone, Really? How do you know? Sonny jumped down and shrugged. The soul shards are missing. A few moments later, an expression of understanding appeared on Kai's face. Indeed, most nightmare creatures had no use for soul shards. Just like humans, who directly absorbed soul essence after killing one of their own kind, they fed from the kill itself as opposed to the act of retrieving and crushing the remnants of broken soul cores. If they weren't bizarre terrors like the Soul Devourer, of course. But the chances of encountering another one of those here were rather low. It was reasonable to assume that the soul shards were removed by humans. His discovery was solid enough proof of the fact that it was indeed the First Lord's cohort that had battled and slain the terrifying creature. They had really found signs of the lost expedition. But there was another proof for this conclusion, this one irrefutable. Nephis, who had wandered away from the remains of the demon at some point, suddenly called them over. The members of the cohort glanced at each other, then slowly approached her, trying to understand what was it that she had found. Changing Star was standing near one of the piles of rocks that were littering the ground around the body of the dead creature, looking at it with a solemn expression. Most of them came from its shattered carapace, while some were created because the floor of the quarry was broken apart and churned during the ferocious battle. Why was Nephis so interested in that one in particular? Looking closer, Sonny suddenly realized that this pile of rocks was different from all others. It was lower, roughly oval in shape, its contour too perfect to be the result of a pure coincidence. It seemed as though each rock was painstakingly placed here by a human hand, perhaps in hopes to make the pile as orderly and sturdy as possible. Suddenly, a cold shiver ran down Sonny's spine. He finally realized what he was looking at. This was not really a pile of rocks. It was a grave. Chapter 247. The Mist. Standing around the cairn, the members of the cohort looked at it with somber expressions, except for Cassie, who turned away and faced the mountainside, as though trying to hide her emotions. Now that they knew what they were looking at, their mood suddenly became forlorn and solemn. People stranded on the forgotten shore were well acquainted with death and tragedy, but finding this lonely grave so far away from any place where another human could find it, lost under the alien gray sky of the dream realm, was still a poignant revelation. None of them had ever met the dreamers of the first cohort, but after living in the shadow of their legendary achievements and hearing stories of their deeds for so long, it felt as though this grave belonged to one of their own. Because of how bleak and tense the reality of the bright castle was, it was easy to forget that in this cursed world, all of them were fellow humans. But in front of the quiet grave, the truth was stark and cutting. It was them alone against the endless tide of nightmare creatures, and every human life lost diminished them all. Sunny sighed and noticed that there were words carved into one of the stones placed on top of the cairn. It took a while to make sense of the inscription, because it wasn't written with the runes he had grown accustomed to. Instead, it was written in simple letters of the human language, which looked strange and alien in this forsaken land. Cut into the stone by unknown means, a single sentence was left behind on the otherwise unmarked grave. Her nightmare is over. With a heavy heart, Sunny silently repeated it several times. It was strange how much meaning could be expressed with so few words. They echoed in his mind and lingered there, leaving a deep and mournful mark. Rest in peace, whoever you are. I hope that your dreams are sweet and serene now. With that, he turned away and gritted his teeth. When would their own nightmare be over? The other members of the cohort were slowly coming back to their sudden reverie. Kai sighed and looked at Changing Star, his face full of sadness. I guess this is what we've been looking for. The First Lord and his expedition definitely passed this way. But what now? Nevis threw a last glance at the grave and turned to face the charming archer. There should be an entrance to an old mine somewhere nearby. From what Cassie had seen, this is the way in which they went. Sunny frowned. Something in what she said made him uneasy. But why? Turning his head, he looked at Cassie, who was still silently standing a few steps away from them, her head turned to the mountains. It seemed as though the blind girl was enjoying the sight of white mist that was flowing down the mountain slope, slowly approaching the valley. She had been awfully quiet all this time. With an ominous feeling suddenly gripping his heart, Sunny gestured to Nephis to draw her attention. Changing Star frowned, then followed his gaze and slightly changed in the face. Walking over to her friend, she carefully placed her hand on the blind girl's shoulder. Instantly, Cassie flinched and turned around, her face pale. Cassie? Did you see something? There was an expression of terror written on the blind girl's face. For a few moments, she just breathed heavily, as though trying to control herself. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet, but steady. The mist. We must all get underground before the mist comes. If not, all of us will die. Nephis didn't waste any time questioning Cassie further. Turning around, she shouted, Sunny, Knight, find the entrance to the mine, quick! A moment later, Kai rose into the air and dashed toward the giant amphitheater on the opposite side of the quarry. Sunny did not hesitate too. His shadow detached from his feet and glided away with startling speed. Despite the urgency of the situation, he remained calm. So, I guess there is a reason why we haven't met a single living creature in this place, after all. Sunny had expected something like this to happen from the very moment they entered the foothills of the Hollow Mountains. Even before learning about how dangerous these peaks were, he had already known that no land that the Crimson Coral was incapable of growing on could be safe. Castor, Effie, prepare to move as soon as the scouts find anything. Glancing at the white wall of mist that was already starting to seep into the valley, Nephis lingered for a moment, then summoned her sword. Behind her, Cassie rose slightly above the ground and unsheathed the quiet dancer, holding the elegant rapier in her left hand. Two transparent wings turned into a blur behind her back. Looking at them, Sunny sighed and walked over to stand near the stone saint. His mind was preoccupied with perceiving the world through the shadow. Then, he closed his eyes to concentrate on his other senses. The Shadow and Kai found the entrance of the mine almost simultaneously. A tall archway was cut right into the side of the mountain, with false columns carved into the rock around it. The mouth of the tunnel was dark and ominous. There was a twisting path leading away from the mine into the quarry. Sonny couldn't see where it exited the maze of stone blocks, but was sure that Kai would see it from above. Opening his eyes, he noticed that the wall of mist was now looming above them, mere seconds from falling down into the quarry, and said, "Follow me!" With that, he ran toward the general direction of where the mine was situated. The others ran behind him, exerting as much speed as they could manage. Except for Castor, of course. Halfway to the wall of the quarry, Kai landed near them and gestured to a barely visible opening between the stone steps. "There! Hurry!" They entered the hidden path and ran as fast as they could, soon approaching the wide tunnel. At the very edge of darkness, Sonny stopped for a second and looked back at the swiftly approaching wall of mist. As he gazed into the milky fog, a cold and heavy feeling of dread suddenly grasped his heart. Not wasting any more time, he turned around and dove into the shadows. A few moments later, the mist swirled around the entrance of the tunnel and devoured the rest of the world. Chapter 248. Those Who Survived. Leaving the mouth of the tunnel and the swirling white mist behind, the cohort cautiously went further into the darkness. As they walked, they summoned the memories that produced light to illuminate the way. The tunnel leading into the mine was wide and spacious. Despite the ruthless flow of time, it had remained in perfect condition. Just like the ancient wall that surrounded the Dark City, the floor was inclined and led down, deep into the belly of the mountain. Sonny sighed, not happy with the idea that they had to travel further into this deadly region of the Dream Realm. Who knew what horrors lived in the darkness at the roots of the Hollow Mountains? The only thing that consoled him was that, with some luck, the cohort wouldn't have to go too far. They just had to find the remains of the doomed expedition that had disappeared somewhere down below. He wasn't entirely comfortable hoping that those people had died sooner rather than later, but they were dead either way. What Sonny cared about was for him and his companions to not follow suit. Walking at the back of the party, he glanced at the 5 people in front of him. How did Changing Star's cohort stack against that of the First Lord? Were they weaker, stronger, or just about the same? His brow furrowed. Regarding Nephis herself, he doubted that the young man who had led a group of sleepers to conquer the Bright Castle could have been more powerful or driven than her, at least not at the start. However, he had much more time to accumulate power and resources before venturing into the Hollow Mountains to find his death. 15 years ago, when he had entered the Dream Realm and got stranded on the Forgotten Shore, things were much different from now. The Immortal Flame Clan was yet to fall, for one. In fact, it was not long after Broken Sword, Neph's father, had become the first human to conquer the Third Nightmare and achieve the rank of Saint. Would the world be different if the First Lord managed to find the way out and return to reality? Yes, most likely. If the era of the Nightmare Spell had shown anything to humanity, it was that history was often changed by individuals, as opposed to events and invisible currents. The influence one extraordinary person could exert on history in a time of adversity was hard to deny. From everything that Sonny knew about the First Lord, a man like him could have done a lot to improve the position humanity was in. What a shame that he had perished in this god-forsaken hell. The story of his incredible deeds known only to a handful of people as unfortunate as him. But how many were there of such brilliant youths killed before their time by the Nightmare Spell? In the end, history was not written by the best, but by those who survived. Glancing at the people walking in front of him, Sonny couldn't help but think, how many of us will survive? Each member of the cohort was incredibly strong. Just like Nephis was at least an equal to the First Lord, her companions were most likely equal to his. Because of Effie's light-hearted and carefree demeanor, it was easy to forget how fearsome of a warrior she was. The Huntress had not survived 3 years of stalking monsters in the cursed streets of the Dark City alone by accident. Hundreds upon hundreds of vicious nightmare creatures fell by her hand. As much as Sunny hated to admit it, Castor was a true powerhouse among the sleepers, too. His incredible aspect ability, outstanding skill, cold intelligence, and wide arsenal of inherited memories made him a deadly threat to anyone foolish enough to become his enemy. Kai was not as ferocious of a fighter as the core members of the cohort, but his ability to fly, coupled with the mastery of the bow and the ascended arrow that Sunny had sold him, made him a real menace in a battle, too. Cassie was not much of a fighter, but her gift was arguably more important than any combat aspect ability could ever be, especially so on the Forgotten Shore, where inconceivable dangers lurked under each rock. And then there was Sunny himself. Sunny was, perhaps, the deadliest of them all. If he wanted to, he could have killed every member of the cohort twice over, with the exception of Nephis herself, of course. If the two of them had to face each other in battle, he didn't count his chances too high. At least for now. As they walked deeper into the mine, there were more tunnels forking away from the main one. The cohort turned a few times, choosing the path that led further down underground. Soon, the walls surrounding them changed. More and more, they were decorated with the intricate stone carving that the inhabitants of the ancient city had loved so much. At first, these carvings were strictly decorative and mostly senseless, shaped into beautiful patterns of lines and simple images. But then, slowly, something about them changed. Sunny was, perhaps, the only one who paid attention to the carvings. Due to his passion for learning the history of this ancient civilization, he had spent a lot of time doing the same thing back in the Dark City, where there were a lot of similar things. He was still planning to clear the floor of the ruined library of rubble and study the vast fresco that was hidden beneath, the project he had been working on before the events of these recent weeks had taken him away. However, the condition of the carvings back in the ancient city was mostly terrible. The unknown disaster that had wiped out its inhabitants, the passage of time, and the nightmare creatures left most of them in ruins. Here in the remote mine, however, the carvings were preserved in pristine condition. When Sunny finally saw what was depicted on them, his breath became faster. The answers to many questions that were tormenting him were right there, carved into these walls. Chapter 249 Curse of Darkness. Depicted on the ancient engravings, a beautiful land was bathed in sunlight. Lush forests, glistening rivers, and fields of flowers surrounded human cities built of stone. From what Sunny could tell, this was the Forgotten Shore before the mysterious and terrifying curse had turned it into the desolate hell it was today. In the next mural, the beautiful land rested under the sky that was full of stars. Suddenly, one of them fell to the ground, causing a wave of destruction to wash over the human cities. When people approached the center of the crater left behind by the falling star, Sunny almost stumbled when he saw the next engraving. In it, a naked human figure was standing at the bottom of the crater, wreathed in light. The inhabitants of the stone cities were surrounding the radiant figure, dressed in archaic garments and armor. The figure seemed beautiful and pure, as though untouched by the imperfections of the mundane world. What made Sunny lose his composure was not its beauty, and not how eerily familiar the soft radiance emanated by its skin was, but its face. On it, 3 eyes were burning with pure, incandescent light. 2 were just like that of a human, with the third one situated above the other ones, right in the middle of the creature's forehead. Just like that of the terrible skull that the walking colossus had shattered with his stone hammer in the middle of a raging storm. What does it mean? What is this thing? To Sonny's dismay, the next engraving was heavily damaged. He couldn't discern anything of what was depicted on it. However, the one after that was in almost perfect condition. On it, the radiant figure was kneeling on the ground, its chest pierced by the spear of the tallest human among the inhabitants of the beautiful land. What flowed from the terrible wound, however, was not blood, but an endless flood of pure darkness. Why? Why did they attack it? What happened? Left without an answer, Sonny walked forward and soon reached the next mural. He saw darkness devouring the humans gathered around the fatally wounded creature and spread. Soon, it devoured the crater left by the fallen star, too. And then, it devoured the entire world. The curse of all-consuming darkness, he whispered. Finally, Sonny got a glimpse at the origin of the terrible disaster that had destroyed this land and turned it into a hellish nightmare. Although the details of it were still unclear, one of the mysteries he had been trying to solve now had an answer. But the story told by the engravings was not yet over. Walking further into the ancient mine, Sonny learned of what had happened next. As the darkness spread across the world, it reached the skies. The stars were either devoured by it or fell down, turning the sky into a terrible, lightless abyss. The starless void. The sun never rose above the cursed land again, leaving humans trembling in the cold. Soon, horrifying creatures came from the darkness to devour them. The best and the brightest of the ancient civilization took arms to defend their cities, and for a while they were able to resist the tide of monsters. But then, humans themselves started to turn into abominable horrors. At that point, Sonny felt a cold shiver running down his spine and couldn't help but tremble. Not because he was affected by the tragic disaster that had befallen these ancient people, but because it all seemed so terrifyingly familiar. The details might not have been the same, but the end result was eerily similar to what was happening in the real world right now. A curse that suddenly appeared and spread across the entire world. The horrible monsters that came from nowhere to attack settlements and devour humans. The champions who had taken charge of defending their kind from the abominable creatures. And the fact that some humans had begun turning into those creatures themselves. Was it not the same as the nightmare spell spreading like a plague across the globe? The nightmare creatures coming through the gates, the awakened rising to fight against them, and the unfortunate souls who failed their first nightmare, transforming into monstrous abominations. The only difference was that the story of the civilization of the Forgotten Shore was already over. Eventually, the curse had destroyed it. The people of his own world, however, were still trying to resist such fate. But was it even possible to defeat fate? The inhabitants of the Forgotten Shore were proud and mighty, and they were capable of building cities that stood for thousands of years and fighting against the most terrifying monsters on equal footing. And yet, in the end, they were utterly obliterated and wiped out. Their land had become a cursed desert. Would the real world turn into a desolate hell, like the Forgotten Shore too, one day? With a dark expression on his face, Sonny turned away from the engraving he was staring at and walked away. There were a few more left ahead still. On one of them, 7 heroes came together from different parts of the Dark Land. Under their protection and guidance, people living in the darkness migrated from their half-destroyed cities and came to the shore of the vast crater. There, they built a new home for themselves, one surrounded by a mighty wall that no monster could scale or breach. One of the heroes, a man depicted with a mason's hammer in his hand, was in charge of building the wall. Despite the fact that the part of the engraving depicting his face was damaged, it was unmistakably one of the 7 founders of the Starlight Legion, the man whose statue had carried them across the forgotten shore. In the second-to-last engraving, the mighty wall was finished, and the city was prospering amidst the darkness. The 7 heroes stood at some distance from it, surrounding... Sunny's eyes narrowed. The 7 heroes were surrounding an inconceivably tall tower. It loomed above them, connecting heaven and earth like the axis of the world. Despite its cyclopean height, the tower was still unfinished. The Crimson Spire. Only it was not crimson yet, as there were no growths of cursed coral covering its walls. On the last engraving, the tower was complete, and on top of it, a new sun was burning bright, bathing the land and the celebrating people in the light once again. The darkness was gone. Chapter 250. Defiant Oath. Sunny stared at the last engraving for a few moments, and then continued walking. The revelations he had uncovered on the walls of the ancient mine gave him a lot to think about. The truth that he had been piecing together for a very long time was finally more complete than fragmented. So, something had indeed fallen from the sky and put a start to the eventual destruction of this land. Sunny had suspected that this was the case for a while now, especially after witnessing the colossal impact crater that was situated between the Dark City and the Ashen Barrow. At times, he had almost been ready to believe that it was really the result of the vile thieving bird dropping the Weaver's eye on the mortal realm below, as written in the description of the lineage memory he had consumed. The thieving bird had gone mad after looking at the reflection of the unknown, which was apparently forever frozen in the depths of Weaver's pupil. The madness and corruption that reigned over the forgotten shore were similar enough for him to draw a parallel. However, now he knew that it had been an actual being that had fallen from the skies, wreathed in light and flame. A beautiful figure that emanated brilliant radiance and had 3 eyes on its terrible, perfect face. Sunny didn't know what led the humans to attack it, but they had killed the creature, perhaps managing such a feat only because it was already weakened by its fall from the heavens and the events that had sent it plummeting down. But by doing so, they had unleashed the flood of darkness and caused the destruction of their land. Sunny was under the impression that the annihilation of the ancient civilization had been instantaneous, but as it turned out, humans had continued to fight against the curse for a long time. Generations, even. That's why the founders of the Starlight Legion were described as being born in the all-consuming darkness. He didn't know whether the monsters that came to feast on the human flesh had been contained within the body of the fallen being along with the ocean of darkness, or whether they were all humans corrupted by the curse, with those present at the moment of the creature's death becoming the most terrifying ones. What he did know, however, was that the Starlight Legion had managed to push the monsters back and build an impregnable fortress for the humans under their protection. That fortress would later become the Dark City. And then, the founders of the Legion had achieved something more inconceivable. They had built the Cyclopean Spire and somehow used it to create an artificial star. Yes, the sun shining above the Forgotten Shore was not real. It was, in fact, a human creation. Speak about ambition. It was hard not to feel awe after learning that those 7 madmen had actually managed to create a sun. They had made a defiant oath to return light to the cursed land, and gone about it with terrifying resolve and sincerity. The story depicted in the ancient engravings ended with a celebration. The forces of good had vanquished the curse of darkness and brought a new era of light and prosperity to the inhabitants of the ancient city. However, that was not where history ended. Something happened between then and now that had caused the obliteration of the ancient civilization, the corruption of the spire, and the appearance of the Crimson Labyrinth. But what? That was a mystery for another day. Perhaps you would be able to find the answer to it back at the Dark City. What Sunny did note, however, was the difference between the dark reality shown in the engravings and the state the Forgotten Shore was in now. Yes, the ancient murals showed a world completely devoid of light, but it was different from the hell that Sunny and the other members of the cohort knew. The engravings did not show the curse of darkness as a literal sea. With no sun and no sea, there was no cycle of tides that turned the Forgotten Shore into an ocean of black water every night. The Dark Sea had appeared at the same time as the Labyrinth, then? Or at least as the result of the same event. Sunny was sure that the two were connected, but he didn't know what significance that information hid. The other thing he had noted was that, while the other members of the party were initially indifferent to the ancient engravings, at some point that changed. When they had been walking past the mural depicting the radiant being with 3 incandescent eyes, Nephis had stopped and looked at it for several long moments. Then she turned her head away, lingered for a second, then continued walking. Sunny had not missed that detail. However, he couldn't even begin to guess what it meant. Sometime later, they entered a wide circular hall. In the center of it, a dark chasm opened into the depths of the mountains, leading so far down that Sunny couldn't even see the bottom. It looked like the gates of the underworld. Thousands of years ago, there were wooden ladders and platforms leading down the main shaft of the mine, as well as a system of ropes and pulleys to lower the miners and lift containers full of precious ores up. Of course, all of that had rotted and collapsed a long time ago. With a sigh, Sunny glanced at Nephis and asked, "We are climbing down, aren't we?" Instead of answering, she simply summoned the golden rope and shrugged. He shook his head. "Wait. At least give me some time to scout ahead and see if anything is waiting for us at the bottom of this thing." With that, he sent his shadow down the wall of the endless shaft. The shadow wasn't very ecstatic at the prospect of gliding down into the depths of the scary well, though. Giving Sunny a resentful glare, it sighed and dove down with visible reluctance. A few minutes later, the shadow reached as far down as the range of shadow control allowed. It was still not at the very bottom of the mine, but at least there were no primordial horrors in its sight. Sunny summoned the Dark Wing and gave the members of the cohort a nod. "We can proceed. Be ready, though. Who knows what might happen." Chapter 251. Boundary of the Underworld. Standing on the edge of the bottomless well, Sunny sighed and summoned the prowling thorn. Then he commanded the dark wing to come to life and took a step into the emptiness. The dragonfly wings of his enchanted cloak were too fragile to rely on them alone in a situation that posed unknown risks. It was better to have a backup at hand. Softly gliding down, he descended in a straight line for a few moments, then made a turn and glanced at the other members of the party. The golden rope had been thrown into the darkness. Nephis, Effie, and Castor were already climbing down, while Kai hovered near them, ready to draw his bow should anything attack the cohort. Cassie was by his side, holding Quiet Dancer in her hand. The elegant rapier served as her guide as well as support, allowing the blind girl to make better use of the transparent wings. With it, she was able to zip around with considerable speed, or stay in one place without any surface beneath her feet. Handy. Just like that, the cohort descended to the bottom of the ancient mine. Sunny was gliding down in a wide spiral, sometimes close enough to the wall of the well to touch it with his hand. He was slightly ahead of the rest of the group. When the distance between them grew too much, he would insert the dagger into a crack in the stone and wait for others, attached to the vertical wall like a strange insect. His shadow moved further and further down, exploring the darkness below. Despite the tension that permeated the air, in the end, nothing had attacked the group of descending humans. They discovered the reason for this unexpected respite at the bottom of the mine. Sunny was the first one to land on solid ground, with other members of the cohort still a few dozen meters away. For some time, he was left in complete darkness. As soon as he took a step, something crunched under his foot. Looking down, Sunny saw a piece of pale bone. A few meters away from him, the remains of a giant skeletal creature lay broken on the ground. It resembled a snake with hundreds of tiny claws growing from its belly and a terrifying round maw. Glancing up, he judged that the length of the dead abomination was enough to coil around the whole shaft of the mine at least several times. While Sunny was thinking, the other members of the cohort approached the ground. The light of their lantern memories fell on him, then shone further, revealing the remains of the colossal bone worm. Exposed by this light, a nimble shadow glided on the stone and attached itself to Sunny's feet. Nephis was the first one to jump down. Glancing at the repulsive nightmare creature, she outstretched one hand and asked, "Sunny?" He shook his head. "It's dead. Nothing is moving out here." Soon, all of them were on the ground. Gathering around the giant worm, everyone had the same thought. Fighting that thing on the vertical wall of the well would have been a true nightmare. Sunny didn't know how the members of the lost expedition had managed to defeat the terrifying creature, but was thankful to them. He would not have wanted to test the durability of the Darkwing if that thing suddenly lunged at him from the dark. There was a disturbing question now in his mind, however. If the cohort of the First Lord was strong and capable enough to slay the stone abomination that used to guard the quarry, and the worm that lived in the well of the mine, then what kind of a horror had killed them all in the end? With a dark expression on his face, Sunny turned away from the dead creature and walked into the darkness. Not too far from the corpse of the abominable worm, they stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The makeshift fire pit was built on the rock floor, with 5 large stones surrounding it for the humans to sit on. A bit further, a low barricade was constructed out of the rubble, protecting the camp from unwelcomed visitors. The lost expedition had definitely been here. Since they had been walking, climbing, and running for the better half of a day, the cohort decided to settle for the night and continue the search tomorrow. Soon, the orange glow of a bonfire chased away the darkness. It was a bit strange to relax and cook food in the same place where the First Lord and his companions had rested and prepared theirs all those years ago. Sonny felt as though he was touching history, or, rather, making it. However, he didn't have too much time for empty thoughts. If what Nephis had told him at the start of this expedition was true, tomorrow was going to be his time to shine. The next day, the cohort ventured further into the tunnels of the ancient mine. No one could tell how deep underground they were exactly, but the feeling of countless tons of stone looming over their heads, ready to come crashing down and bury them under their terrible weight, was not a pleasant one. They were in the belly of the mountains now. After several hours of walking through narrow tunnels, Sonny suddenly felt a soft breeze touch his cheeks. A few minutes later, a distant rustle reached his ears. The deeper they went into the darkness, the louder that rustle became, until finally turning into an easily discernible murmur of running water. Soon, they reached the dark shore of a wide underground river. The running water was black as ink, but not in the way that the waves of the cursed sea had been. There was no smell of salt in the air, too. Wisps of mist were rising above the surface of the subterranean river, swirling in the silent darkness. It looked like a boundary of the underworld. There was a stone pillar built on the shore, and tied to it, a beautiful boat made of pale wood swayed gently on the cold, black surface of the dark river. Looking at the graceful boat, Sonny sighed. It was time to earn his keep. Chapter 252 Unseen. This was the last secret about the fate of the lost expedition that Cassie had gleaned from her visions. But even then, the knowledge she had received was fragmented and incomplete. All she could tell the members of the cohort was that, once they crossed the dark river and until reaching the next boundary, they had to keep their eyes closed at all cost, no matter what happened. No living thing could see what lay beyond these cold waters and remain whole. At least that was what she told them. Cassie didn't really know herself what would happen if someone failed to follow that rule, but said that she had never felt more terror in that short moment before the vision showing her the fate of the lost expedition had shattered and everything had grown dark. This was telling a lot, considering what kinds of horrors the blind girl saw in her visions routinely. In any case, this was where Sonny came in. While looking through the eyes of the shadow was still too dangerous, he could lead the cohort to their destination with the help of his ability to send space through the shapes of shadows populating it, at least in theory. Standing on the shore of the dark river, 6 humans tied the golden rope around their waists. When everyone was ready, Nephis took out 6 strips of cloth and a block of wax. Lighting a small white flame on her palm, she sighed and turned to Effie. "You're first." The huntress made a complicated face, but then obediently approached their leader. What followed next looked simultaneously intimate and disturbing. Using her flames to melt the wax, Changing Star gently took Effie's face in her hands and, after the huntress shut her eyes tightly, sealed them with melted wax. Then she tied a strip of cloth around Effie's head to hold it in place. One after another, every member of the cohort went through the same procedure. When Sonny's turn came, he shifted slightly when Neff's cool hands touched his cheeks. A few moments later, he was blind. This is... Is this how Cassie lives? Commanding his shadow to not see anything, Sonny was left in utter darkness. However, he still had it better than the blind girl. His shadow sense was still working at least. With its help, Sonny could more or less tell what was there. This form of perception was vastly different from sight, but it could serve the same purpose in a pinch, be it poorly, if conditions were right. Luckily, he had practiced navigating the world with the help of nothing else but shadow sense in the past. This was how he had defeated the strange basilisk creature in the Dark City, among other things. Leading the group of staggering humans to the graceful boat, he helped them to board it and untied their rope holding it in place. Then, Sonny found the oar and pulled on it, propelling the boat forward across the dark river. Soon, cold mist shrouded everything around. The deeper into the mist they sailed, the more it felt like they were leaving one world behind and entering another. A much darker, much more ancient, much more terrifying world. No one felt compelled to speak, so the silence was broken only by the murmur of rushing water and the creaking of the wooden oar. This is not too bad. Yeah, I'm not scared witless at all. Calming himself down with these silly thoughts, Sonny continued to guide the boat. However, one thing kept making him shiver. Being surrounded by mist and having to keep his eyes closed, Sonny couldn't help but remember the harrowing encounter with the being that appeared in a veil of fog and tried to lure him into gazing at it using a stolen voice. Was this where it had come from? After some time had passed, he couldn't tell how much, no matter how hard he tried. Sonny suddenly sensed a solid mass in the distance. This was the opposite shore of the dark river. Soon they were drawing near it. As the bottom of the boat scraped against stone, Sonny jumped to the pier and tied the rope around the stone pillar. Then he helped the others disembark. Turning his head, he sensed another shape swaying on the surface of the water. There was a second boat here, presumably the one the First Lord and his companions used to cross. But unlike Nephis and her cohort, there had not been an oracle in their ranks. No one had warned them to keep their eyes shut. Maybe this was the reason why none of them had returned. Turning his back to the river with a strong feeling of unease, Sonny faced the mouth of the tunnel that led deeper underground. Letting out a resentful sigh, he slightly tugged on the golden rope and took a step forward. The other members of the cohort had no choice but to follow him. A few seconds later, they disappeared into the tunnel, leaving the shore of the silent river behind. As soon as Sonny stepped into the tunnel, he felt cold shivers running down his spine. Although he couldn't see anything about it, he could tell that it was different from the ones they had traveled earlier. This one still felt like it had been cut through the flesh of the mountains by someone, or something, as opposed to being formed by a natural process. However, its creators were unmistakably different from the humans that had created the mine and the quarry outside. Everything about it was more pronounced, more skillful. The shadows populating the tunnel were different, too. They were much deeper, much darker, and much, much more ancient. Soon the tunnel turned into a maze of wide passages, all filled with nothing but mist and silence. Another maze. Of course it's a maze. Everything in this damn place just has to be a maze. Before Sonny could finish the thought, though, he suddenly froze, paralyzed by fear. Because right in front of them, he felt the presence of a shadow that was different from all the others. A human shadow. Chapter 253. Without a Master. The human shadow stood lonesomely in the mist, strangely aloof and motionless. As Sonny pulled on the golden rope to command his companions to stop, it shifted slightly and turned away, then became still once again. Sonny sensed a cold, dreadful feeling settle in his heart. The possibility of encountering another human in this dark and terrifying place was already unsettling enough. He did not consider even for a second that one of the members of the lost expedition could have survived down here, in the darkness, for all these years. Not unless they were no longer human. But even that was not the cause for the coldness and dread he felt. The real reason had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with his unique aspect. Because of it, Sunny sensed that there was something terribly, utterly wrong with the shadow. The feeling he got from it was one of eerie and utter wrongness. However, it didn't seem to be dangerous or hostile. Instead, it felt lost, empty, and mournful. The shadow was full of sorrow and anguish that he could not describe with words. Sunny was not that empathetic when it came to humans, but strangely, he couldn't help but share in the suffering of this lonely shadow. Maybe because, in a sense, they were kin. As he was observing the shadow, unsure what to do, it made a few steps in a random direction and then stopped hesitantly, lingering there without moving. Then it walked back and froze once again. It was as though the shadow was lost. A few moments later, Sunny finally understood the nature of the deep feeling of wrongness he felt in the lonesome shadow. When he did, a cold shiver ran through his entire body. The reason why this shadow was so strange and eerie was because it wasn't connected to anyone. There was no human casting it. Not anymore, at least. The human that the shadow had once belonged to was gone, cut from existence by some unknown power. Sunny couldn't sense any bones anywhere either. It was as if the human had not been killed, but simply erased, while the shadow remained to wander aimlessly in the mist for all eternity. What a terrible fate. But the question remained. What was he supposed to do now? The shadow was in his way. Sunny had to either walk past it or return back to try and find another way through the maze. But what threat could this pitiful thing pose? It was just a shadow, after all. His own couldn't harm a fly no matter how hard it tried. This one had to be the same. With a deep sigh, Sunny slowly walked forward. With each step he took, he could sense the lonesome shadow better. At some point, it sensed him too. Turning to face Sunny, the shadow hesitated for a few moments, then tentatively glided closer. He could feel an outburst of muted emotions radiating from it. Surprise, hope, and then sudden despair. Realizing that he wasn't its long-lost master, the shadow froze. Its shoulders dropped. Sensing the deep well of loneliness, anguish, and sorrow in front of him, Sunny tilted his head to the side. Then, following an impulse, he outstretched his hand to the shadow. Here, take my hand. You don't have to be alone anymore. The shadow trembled, as if it heard his silent invitation. Then, it lingered for a few moments and approached him with uncertainty. Finally, it raised its hand and tentatively placed it in the hand of his own shadow. A moment later, it disappeared. Sunny sighed. Your shadow grows stronger. Diving into the soul sea, he walked along the rows of silent shadows standing on the surface of the tranquil water. And there, just as he had expected, he saw a new one. A shadow of a graceful young woman was standing among them, as motionless and still as the rest of them. Her anguish, sorrow, and loneliness were gone. The shadow seemed to finally be at peace. Sunny looked at her for a few moments, his heart heavy. Finally, he said, Welcome. Rest now. Your nightmare is over. With that, he left the silent sea and sighed again. Standing in the darkness with his eyes sealed shut, Sunny remained motionless for some time. Then he pulled on the golden rope and led the cohort further into the mist. Sunny didn't know how long they wandered around the dark maze. More than one, he had ended up at a dead end and had to search for another path. It was hard to not lose track of all the turns, the twisting tunnels, but he had somehow managed to stay on track. On the way, he had found 3 more shadows. Each of them was just like the first one, lost and lonesome. And just like the first one, they eventually took his hand and were absorbed into his soul sea. The 4 of them, the young woman and 3 men, now stood silently together, united once again, even though their masters were long gone. Seeing them together gave Sunny a little solace, no matter how misguided it was. There were 5 stones arranged around the fire at the campsite left behind by the lost expedition, hinting that 5 people had descended into the ancient mine. 4 of them had eventually perished in this eerie, dark place. But no matter how hard Sunny searched, he couldn't find the 5th shadow. The First Lord himself was not here. Could it be that he had somehow managed to survive and leave the maze of mist? At some point, Sunny felt someone pull on the golden rope. Turning around, he walked a few steps back and stopped near Cassie. Feeling his approach, the blind girl raised her hand and pointed at one of the tunnels. Understanding what she wanted to say, Sunny led the cohort in that direction. Soon, the sound of rushing water reached his ears. Sometime later, they came to the shore of another subterranean river, and they had reached the 2nd boundary. Chapter 254. The First Lord. For a moment, Sunny was afraid that they had been walking in circles all this time and now returned exactly to where they had started. But then he calmed himself down and noted that this river, while as eerie as the one they had crossed on a wooden boat, was rather different. He couldn't exactly explain it, but it didn't feel the same. Plus, there was no pier with 2 boats tied to stone pillars anywhere in sight, or rather, sense. Instead, there was a bridge. Sunny could feel its shadow falling on the cold water, solid and firm as the stone it was built from. The bridge arched over the river, leading far into the distance. Not wishing to spend another minute in the terrible maze that no living thing could see if it hoped to remain alive, Sunny led the cohort toward the bridge. If Cassie was correct, they would be safe after crossing the 2nd river. Sunny surely hoped that it was true, because the long journey where he had to play the role of a guide for 5 blind people had been nothing short of exhausting. After spending 7, or was it 8 by now, months on the forgotten shore, Sunny had thought that he possessed a high tolerance for terror, but this last ordeal tested the limits of his mental endurance. Walking through that dark place with his sight taken away, it was a miracle that Cassie had somehow managed to remain sane at all. He tensed up when they entered the bridge, expecting for something dreadful to happen at the last moment. But the silence was not broken by anything, except the sound of rushing water, their steps, and laborious breathing. The cohort walked on the bridge, leaving the dark maze behind. Soon, they could feel the mist surrounding them grow thinner. At some point, it was gone. They crossed the river without any trouble and returned to solid ground again. Making several more steps, Sunny stopped and finally allowed himself to tremble. Then, he opened his mouth and said in a hoarse voice, "Are we through?" Although Cassie had not said anything about the need to remain quiet, each of them subconsciously avoided speaking ever since entering the mist. Because of that, the sound of his own voice startled Sunny a little. A few moments later, Cassie answered in a hesitant tone, I think so." Without wasting any more time, Sunny untied the cloth that covered his eyes and removed the wax from them. Then he carefully opened them and looked around. They were standing on a stone shore inside a vast cave, through which the underground river was flowing unobstructed. Some distance away from them, the wall of the cave came down, with the mouth of a wide tunnel visible in it. By his side, other members of the cohort were removing the strips of cloth. Sonny could hear the sighs of relief coming from them. However, his attention was instantly drawn to Nephis, who had already opened her calm gray eyes and was looking at something behind him. Turning around, Sonny followed her gaze and froze. Just a few meters away from them, on the shore of the dark river, he saw a human skeleton. It was sitting on the cold stones, its back straight, facing the water. Unlike the ferocious undead from the catacombs of the Dark City, this one was tranquil and untouched by the corruption of the forgotten shore. This was the place where the first lord of the Bright Castle had died. The young man whom the members of the cohort only knew by his title had died on the shores of the cold underground river, just a few meters away from the bridge that he had used to escape the terrible place which, according to Cassie, no living being should have been able to escape. Somehow, he had managed to survive, even without knowing that anyone entering the mist had to keep their eyes closed at all times. But in the end, the wounds he had received there, or something up ahead perhaps, turned out to be too grievous. Before the last vestiges of life abandoned him, the young man, the first lord who had wrestled the Bright Castle from the nightmare creatures, created a safe place for the humans set to the forgotten shore to live, and led an expedition to find a way out of this cursed place, sat down and looked in the direction of the misty dark maze. The place where his friends and companions had died, leaving him alone in the darkness of this forsaken underworld. Looking at the skeleton that sat quietly on the shore of the river, Sonny couldn't help but feel a deep feeling of awe and sorrow. He had never met this young man, but somehow it felt as though they knew each other very well. Everything that humans had on the forgotten shore was thanks to his bravery, power, and skill. What a shame that he had died here, in this lonesome place, with no one to share his last moments and tell the tale of his last deeds. The skeleton was strangely well preserved. It was sitting with its legs crossed, back straight, its hands resting on its hips, as if meditating. The skull of the First Lord gazed at the river with the dark chasms of its empty eyes, strangely calm and at peace. What Sonny noticed, though, was not the whiteness of the bone nor the eternal grin on the bare skull, but a thin strip of light metal resting on it like a humble crown. There was a single bright gemstone on the metal band, placed right above the middle of the skull's forehead. After the 6 of them gathered around the remains of the First Lord and stood there for a while in silence to express their respect for this extraordinary human, Nephis sighed and approached the skeleton. Gently, she took the strip of metal and removed it from the First Lord's head. A moment later, the band suddenly broke into countless sparks of light, which then disappeared, absorbed into her soul core. Sonny's eyes widened. The crown of the First Lord was a memory. Chapter 255 Dawn Shard. As the last spark of light disappeared, Nephis tilted her head to the side and remained silent for a few moments. Then she lowered her gaze and said, addressing the First Lord, "Thank you." She hesitated, as though wishing to say more, but eventually just took a step back. Kai, however, wasn't that reserved. Bowing deeply, he remained with his head down for a while, then straightened his back, looked at the skeleton, and voiced something that a few of them must have been thinking. "Thank you. We will finish what you started." His words echoed above the cold water, eventually disappearing into the darkness. A heavy silence settled above the shore of the underground river. A few seconds later, the charming archer turned to the rest of them and asked with uncertainty, should we bury him?" The members of the cohort looked at each other. Before anyone could voice their opinion, though, Sonny suddenly spoke. No, just leave him as is. He wanted to be closer to his friends when he died, so just don't touch him. With that, he turned his head and looked away. Since the First Lord died outside of the terrible maze, his shadow was gone too. Now it was just dumb and empty, like most shadows cast by inanimate objects. He had not shared in the harrowing fate of his companions, which meant that Sonny couldn't help him reunite with them, even slightly. Neither could they bring the remains of the First Lord back outside to bury him near the girl who had died in the quarry. It was better to just leave him be. Forget about it. Think about something else. Sonny had other matters to consider anyway. That strange memory that Nephis had absorbed. He had never even heard of a memory that could exist outside of someone's soul. Had the First Lord somehow relinquished the ownership of it? Or was this a quality that all shard memories possessed? And it was, without a doubt, another shard memory. Just like Effie's spear and his own stalwart blade, that memory was the reason why Changing Star had ventured on this expedition to begin with. The thing that was supposed to somehow give her a chance of defeating Gunlaug. Sonny stared at Nephis, then said, That headband. What is it called? No, actually, let me guess. Dawn Shard? Dusk Shard? Neph looked at him and didn't answer. Her ivory face was calm and inexorable. Sonny grinned. Full of secrets, are we? A hint of some deep, sharp emotion appeared in her cold gray eyes. A few moments later, she said, Weren't you the one who made it clear that you don't want to be a true member of this cohort? You chose to be a hired blade yourself, did you not? Why would I share my secrets with you? Sonny remained silent for a bit, then sighed. Well, fair enough. I did, and you've no good reason to share anything with me. Suddenly, Nephis smiled. You can change your mind, you know. If you do, I'll naturally tell you everything. He stared at her for a while, then shook his head. No need. Answer me one thing, though. How exactly is that thing supposed to help us defeat Gunlaug? Changing Star lingered for a bit, then simply shrugged. See for yourself. A moment later, the headband left behind by the First Lord weaved itself from sparks of light on her forehead. The bright gemstone in its center softly gleamed. And then, something about the world around Sonny changed. What? He blinked a couple of times, then slowly lowered his gaze and looked at the fabric of the puppeteer's shroud. Or, rather, on the spell weave beneath it. What he saw left Sonny breathless. The 5 glowing embers that served as nexuses for the complicated pattern of ethereal strings permeating the memory suddenly shone brighter. Much, much brighter. In fact, their radiance was now almost as intense as of those inside the Black's onyx armor he had purchased at the memory market. Which was an ascended memory. What the hell? Pulling on the thread tied around his neck, Sonny fished out the blood blossom from under his armor and stared at it, perplexed. The 2 embers inside the intricate pendant had become much brighter, too. Not knowing that Sonny had the ability to peer into the inner weave of memories, Nephis explained. The Dawn Shard possesses a single, but also singularly powerful enchantment. It empowers all memories around it. The area of effect of the enchantment is very large, but the enchantment it provides is ever larger. Oh, you don't say! Staring at his memories, Sonny felt as though he was on the verge of being dumbstruck. Singular was the right word to describe the effect of the Dawn Shard. He had never heard of a memory being capable of rising the power of another by almost an entire rank. Wait, Did she say all memories? All memories. All of them. In a very large radius? Impossible. With that crown on her head, Nephis would not only be able to stand a chance in a fight against Gunlaug, but also make each one of her followers so much more dangerous. She would become a perfect general for a small army of Awakened. But wasn't there something wrong with that statement? Sunny frowned. All memories. Hold on. All? Glancing at Changing Star, he asked, So, that thing makes every memory around you vastly more powerful? Nephis gave him a silent nod. Sunny's frown deepened. Then do you not see a problem here? Won't it enhance that damn golden armor of Ganlaug's too? How exactly does it give you a chance against him, then? She lingered for a few moments, then smiled slightly. It would not, would it? But, hey, do you want me to tell you another secret? Sunny glared at her without saying anything. He knew better than to get himself into such a clumsy trap. Only, as it turned out, there was no trap. Nephis just waited for a bit and continued. It will help me, because the golden armor Gunlaug wears is not a memory. Before he could say anything, she added, In fact, it is an echo. Chapter 256 True Reason. Sunny was silent for a while. An echo. That weird golden armor was actually a copy of some strange, corrupted nightmare creature? What kind of creature took the shape of an armor? But then again, the fact that it looked like an armor didn't mean that it was all it could look like. The main trait of the golden armor was that it seemed to be made out of liquid metal. That metal always flowed and moved around, enveloping Gunlaug's body like a second layer of skin. The only thing that never changed was the mirror-like surface that served him as a face. It wasn't impossible to imagine that the mass of living metal was, in fact, not a memory but a bizarre echo. Not impossible, but a bit of a stretch. Glancing at Nephis, Sunny asked, How do you even know this? She hesitated for a few moments, then said, You already know that we have an ally inside the castle. She was the one who told us. A mysterious spy again. Sunny became even more convinced that this person was of a very high rank among the Bright Lord's servants. Only someone extremely close to him would know such an important secret. In fact, Sunny expected that the paranoid tyrant would never let anyone learn of it. Why would one of Gunlaug's most loyal minions help his enemy? Was it all an elaborate trap orchestrated by the Bright Lord himself? Looking at Changing Star with a deep scowl on his face, he asked, Can this ally of yours even be trusted? If he was right in his guess about the identity of the spy, well, things would become complicated. She was silent for a while, then said evenly, Trusted? Not really. Never, actually. However, we can trust in the information that was provided to us. He raised his eyebrows. And why is that? Nephis shrugged and then answered, her voice indifferent. Because I am the only chance anyone here has of ever getting out of this cursed place, and Gunlaug is not. Interesting. So one of the top ranks of the Bright Lord's forces was an opportunist who desired to return to the real world desperately enough to risk betraying the ruthless tyrant. That person had been loyal to Gunlaug because there was no better alternative, but then changed sides once the last daughter of the immortal Flame Clan appeared like a miracle and promised to save the people of the Forgotten Shore. That ally of hers was either swayed by Neph's rhetoric, like the rest of the unfortunate fools in the Dark City, or was confident of ending up among the few lucky people who would actually have the chance of surviving what was about to come, or just knew something that Sunny did not. In any case, Changing Star seemed to be confident in the information the spy provided, so he did not see the point of doubting it. She wasn't any more naive or trusting than he was, after all. Nephis had learned the art of cynicism from the best. Kai, who had been listening to their conversation with a fair bit of curiosity, suddenly cleared his throat. I am very sorry to interrupt you guys, but I just wanted to ask, since we have found the remains of the First Lord and came into possession of this memory you were discussing, does that mean that the expedition is over? Have we actually accomplished our goal? Really? That, indeed, would seem to be the case. However, Sunny knew better. With a friendly smile, he shook his head. Oh no, buddy. The goal of this expedition has not been achieved yet. The charming archer looked at him with surprise. But didn't we get the thing that will help us defeat Gunlaug? Nephis was staring at Sunny too, a subtle smile on her lips. Yes, Sunny. What else do we have to do? Do tell. He grinned. Well, it's very simple, really. Yes, you told us that the reason for this adventure of ours was to find the means of overpowering the Bright Lord. And it certainly was a reason, but it's not the whole reason, is it? Cassie turned her head slightly to listen to him and sighed. Castor's face, meanwhile, had turned grim. Effie didn't seem to care one way or another. Nephis, on the other hand, just smiled wider. What is the whole reason, then? Sunny gestured at the mouth of the tunnel in front of them. To finish what the First Lord had started, of course. Kai was looking between him and Changing Star, unsure of what was going on. What do you mean, exactly? Sunny shrugged. Think about it, Kai. We saw the same map. What were the symbols drawn at the very edge of it, near the place where the First Lord's expedition had disappeared? The charming archer frowned. There were 3 of them? A crown, a question mark, and a red cross? Sunny smiled. Exactly. There were 6 crosses drawn on the map, each marking one of the headless statues. 2 to the east of the Dark City, 1 to the north, 1 to the west, and 2 to the south. We had visited one of the 2 statues situated to the south already. That's where the spider matriarch had weaved her nest. He turned to Nephis and said, his smile gone. So, the truth of it all is that the First Lord never really intended to find a way through the Hollow Mountains, isn't it? He wasn't a fool who would do something so misguided. No, he came to this godforsaken place for the same reason that we are here. To find the last statue. Changing Star was silent for a bit. When the silence was on the verge of growing uncomfortable, she suddenly said, That is correct. Kai stared at her in astonishment. But why? No, wait, what's so important about that statue? Nephis sighed. This is something that people can only volunteer to do. Anyone who doesn't wish to proceed can stay behind and avoid risking their lives in the battle. In fact, some of us probably should. She turned to face the tunnel, remained silent for a bit, and then said, Yes, somewhere up ahead lies another ancient statue. There will be a powerful creature guarding it. I don't know what that guardian is exactly, but we have to kill it. Anyone who is willing to fight can join me. Others can stay back and wait for my return. She glanced at the members of the cohort and added, However, if you do join me, you'll have to follow one simple rule. No matter what happens, it's imperative that you don't deliver the final blow to the creature, unless you have reached and touched the statue first. Chapter 257 Nightmare Champion. So that's how it works. Initially, Sunny had suspected that the mysterious shard memories were just rewarded to those who managed to slay certain powerful nightmare creatures who dwelled close to the headless statues. The truth, however, turned out to be more complicated. The creature itself, most likely, did not even matter. It was the act of vanquishing a powerful foe after coming in contact with a statue that summoned the memory from oblivion. That was why they had received the Midnight Shard before even learning about how important these ancient monuments were. Sunny, Nephis, and Cassie had taken shelter atop the statue of the ancient knight and killed the carapace demon long after. But no, that didn't make a lot of sense. If this was true, Sunny would have received another shard memory after defeating the Corpse Eater, so not any powerful abomination would do. Each statue seemed to have a nightmare champion tied to it by some invisible bond. The carapace demon, whom the creatures described as cursed soldiers of the fallen legion used to obey, was connected to the statue of the knight. The Iron Matriarch was tied to the statue of the hunter. Which statue had the Dawn Shard come from? The builder, whose monument had somehow come to life and was now wandering the forgotten shore? Rumors said that the First Lord chased it around the labyrinth for a long time, after all. But somehow, Sunny felt that the metal headband had nothing to do with the walking colossus. So many questions. How many champions were still around, anyway? Nephis had not even tried to search for one tied to the builder, nor for one tied to the priestess. How many shard memories were already in the hands of humans? Among the members of the cohort, there were now 3, and they were about to challenge some abominable horror for a chance of receiving the 4th one. Why do I even assume that there are only 3? Sunny tilted his head. Indeed, the fact that he had only seen the Midnight Shard, the Zenith Shard, and the Dawn Shard did not mean that Changing Star had not gotten other ones already. Not counting the memory they were currently hunting, 3 more were unaccounted for. How many had she found already? He smiled darkly. Well, it's going to be revealed sooner or later. Right now, however, there is a more pressing issue. Glancing at Nephis, he asked, What happens if I get the memory? As you reminded so astutely, I am not one of your lackeys. That would throw a wrench in your plans, wouldn't it? Sunny couldn't imagine Changing Star leaving something that important to chance. However, to his surprise, she just shrugged. Keep it, if you want. He frowned. Why was Nephis so nonchalant about the possibility of a shard memory falling into his hands? Wait, why was she so indifferent about him already possessing the Midnight Shard? One possible explanation was that it didn't matter who held the shard memory, as long as it was in human hands. The other explanation made Sunny very uncomfortable. Maybe she was just sure that fate would push the 2 in the same direction. If this was true, then it didn't really matter which one of them possessed the shards. He lingered for a bit, then shook his head and said, Well, what are we waiting for? You didn't really expect any of us to stay behind while others fight, right? Let's go hunt this monster. Honestly, while Sunny couldn't even imagine what type of terrible creature guarded the hidden statue, he was almost excited to find out. He wanted to see what the 6 of them were capable of under the miraculous effect of the Dawn Shard. Himself in particular. Eventually, they arrived at a vast cavern situated somewhere in the depths of the Draconian Mountains. The cavern was large enough to fit the entire bright castle, and the hill it stood upon inside of it. Witnessing its size, Sonny got an inkling that there was a reason why these mountains were called hollow. As his sight pierced the darkness ruling over the vast cavern, Sonny couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe. The floor of it was covered by black sand, while its walls glistened like obsidian. In the center of the cavern stood a giant pillar of dark stone. It was surrounded by massive scaffolds, which nevertheless looked tiny and insignificant on its surface. The silhouette of an unfinished statue was easily discernible, cut from the giant pillar by the unknown sculptor. Its upper torso was almost finished, while the lower half was still encased inside the stone. It was as though a dark giant was struggling to free himself from the pillar of stone that imprisoned him. With a feeling of surprise, Sonny realized that he recognized the details of the unfinished giant's armor and shield. They were eerily similar to the armaments of the Black Knight guarding the ruined cathedral, and to the ones the stone saint wielded too. Looking up, he made sure that the head of the giant statue was missing. Of course it is. All of that only took a fraction of a second. Then, Sonny hastily looked down, trying to notice the guardian of this obsidian cave before the creature noticed them. But it was too late. As soon as the members of the cohort entered the cavern, something moved in the darkness at the base of the statue, and then stepped forward. Sonny shivered. Damnation! Standing on the black sand, a monstrous creature that resembled a cross between a lion and a raven stretched its numerous limbs. Its body was pale as a corpse, while its head and chest were covered with dark feathers. Each was massive in size, with muscles rolling like steel cables under the skin. The creature had 2 powerful hind legs, and 6 more protruding messily from its wide chest, each ending with a set of deadly claws. But the most terrifying feature it possessed was a long, jagged black beak. It was a spire. Messenger! That was all Sonny had time to yell before the vile abomination lunged forward, exploding into a whirlwind of hunger, madness, and death. Chapter 258 Herald of the Crimson Terror. Sonny had already faced off against the Spire Messenger once. Back then, the vile creature had killed several experienced hunters in a span of just a few seconds, and the rest had only been spared this fate because of Effie's strength. That, and the fact that the messenger had no need to fight them, and chose to retreat and search for easier prey. There was nowhere to retreat in this hidden cavern. Sonny didn't even know how the flying abomination had gotten here in the first place. However, he was not the same inexperienced kid he had been all those months ago either. Sonny had grown considerably stronger. His arsenal of memories was better now. His skill and technique were far beyond what he had known in the past, and his kill count had crossed 100 nightmare creatures a long time ago. There was the Stone Saint, too. But, most importantly, his memories were empowered by the Crown of Dawn. Theoretically, Sonny could stack 3 augmentations on the Midnight Shard, 1 from his shadow, 1 from the miraculous crown, and 1 from the Blood Blossom, as long as someone managed to make the messenger bleed. Hopefully, that would be enough to breach the gap between a dormant human and a fallen beast, and allow him to actually wound the abomination, unlike the previous 2 times he had tried to cut into the flesh of similar horrors. Corpse Eater and the giant eel that had tried to hitch a ride on the ancient Colossus. But first, he had to survive. Judging that the puppeteer's shroud had a decent chance of withstanding a blow from the messenger thanks to the enhancement of the Dawn Shard, but also not even remotely willing to put that to the test, Sunny dove to the side. A moment later, the massive abomination collided against two shields, one belonging to Effie, the other to the stone saint. The terrible beak came down, aiming at the huntress. If it was before, the round shield that protected Effie from knee to shoulder would have been easily pierced and torn apart, as if it was made out of paper instead of metal. But due to the empowering aura that emanated from the Dawn Shard, it somehow held. The force of the impact, however, still threw them both back. Even Shadow Saint, whose flesh was made of stone and weighed accordingly, was launched into the air like a doll made of feathers and rags. But they had brought the cohort the precious second to regroup and counterattack. As Kai and Cassie flew in different directions, creating some distance between them and the ferocious abomination, Nephis and Castor attacked from the sides. One sword shined with brilliant white radiance, while the other gleamed with ghostly green light. However, the messenger was still terrifyingly formidable. The memories wielded by the cohort might have been enhanced, but their masters remained the same. They couldn't compete with the fallen creature in terms of raw power and speed. Two of the beast's 6 front limbs swiped forward, deflecting the swords. 2 more shot at the attacking humans, forcing them to retreat while barely staying alive. Then, the messenger twisted its neck and caught Kai in its sight. Its powerful black wings lashed down, creating a small hurricane that threw Nephis and Castor aside. Using powerful hind legs to throw itself into the air, the abomination lunged at the retreating archer, who twisted his body in a desperate attempt to aim his bow. And then, suddenly, a triangular blade cut an arc around one of the legs and tied an invisible string around it. Oh, crap! That was all Sunny had time to think before his hand was jerked forward with incredible force. However, this was exactly what he wanted. With the dark wing turning into a blur behind his back, Sunny used the momentum of the pull to turn his laughably slow levitation into real flight. In fact, he shot in the direction of the messenger as though someone had launched him from a cannon. The midnight shard flashed through the air and bit into the abomination's flesh. Do it! Indeed. With both the shadow and the dawn shard augmenting it, the stalwart blade was able to cut into the flesh of the fallen beast. Granted, it felt as though he was trying to cut stone, but it was enough. Sunny aimed at the base of the messenger's wing. With all the speed given to him by the combination of using the dark wing to levitate and the prowling thorn to create momentum, the blow Sunny had delivered was truly devastating. In fact, it was so forceful that every bone in his hand almost shattered. But he wasn't the one on the sharp end of the sword. The midnight shard cut deep into the wing of the vile abomination, sending rivers of blood streaming down its pale body. As soon as they did, the enchantment of the blood blossom awakened, making the blade even sharper. The elegant Tachi tore through the wing, crippling it. The messenger suddenly lost control of its flight and crashed back to the ground. Eat dust, bastard! After a moment of glee, however, Sunny hurriedly dismissed the dark wing and plummeted down, landing on the sand some distance away from the monstrous beast. While gliding all the way back to the floor of the cavern would have been more comfortable, he wasn't going to become a sitting duck. Crippled wing or not, the messenger could still jump and use the other one. Maybe. At the same time as Sunny hit the ground and rolled, a menacing black arrow suddenly fell from above, piercing the second wing of the fearsome creature. There was no blood coming from the wound, though. The arrow greedily drank it, preventing the blood blossom augmentation from growing a bit stronger. The abomination did not stagger, and slowly turned into a mummy like the iron spiders had. It simply shook its body, causing the arrow to shatter and crumble into a stream of white sparks. But Sonny didn't see any of that. With his back to the messenger, he was already running toward the giant statue with all the speed he had. Chapter 259 Bloody Mayhem. Sonny ran to the statue with every bit of speed he could manage, which was quite a considerable amount by human standards. No, even by those of other sleepers. As the wind whistled in his ears, the shadow flew off the blade of the midnight shard and turned around, observing the wounded abomination. Despite the fact that its wings were mangled, the messenger did not seem perturbed. On the contrary, it opened its terrible beak and let out a blood-curdling shriek, then lunged at the tiny humans with even more bestial fury. "I think it's not happy!" Despite the mortal peril his companions found themselves in, Sonny did not stop to help them. Nephis had said that the creature guarding the cave had to be killed by a person who had touched the ancient statue. Until someone did, this battle was nothing but a futile and stupidly dangerous game. The essence of combat was murder, after all. If no one truly aimed to kill the damned thing, how could they ever hope to survive? So Sonny was helping them, after all, in a way. Behind him, things weren't going well for the cohort. The messenger was too big, too strong, too swift for a group of sleepers, no matter how talented. It was already a miracle that none of them had been torn to pieces already. But how long would that last? As the shadow watched, the terrifying beak came down again, and once again bounced off Effie's stalwart shield. However, this time, a wide crack appeared on the surface of the round shield. Before the huntress could even react, several powerful limbs shot at the cracked shield, each striking it with the force of a cannonball. Finally, the memory gave in and shattered, along with Effie's arm. Sonny saw fragments of bone piercing her olive skin as it twisted at an unnatural angle. "Damn, faster!" As the pillar of dark stone approached, he watched the messenger try to finish the wounded huntress off and be thwarted by the stone saint. Simultaneously, Nephis managed to penetrate the barrier created by the creature's front limbs. Her sword flashed and bit into the pale flesh, leaving a deep gash on the abomination's side. Judging that he was far enough to not be afraid of a sudden attack aimed at his back, Sonny commanded the shadow to turn around and return to his side. His view of the battle immediately disappeared, and soon the shadow caught up and wrapped itself around his body. Sonny's speed doubled. Pursued by the sounds of a ferocious battle, he neared the unfinished statue. However, before he could touch it, a human figure suddenly appeared in front of him in a blur and slid on the black sand, stopping right in front of the stone pillar. It was Castor. The proud legacy didn't look all too well. His shiny scale armor was torn by the claws of the terrible beast, leaving 4 deep wounds on his muscular chest. Blood was streaming from them, leaving the handsome young man pale and disheveled. No, it wasn't just that. Castor seemed a bit off somehow. Sonny just couldn't tell what was wrong with him exactly. He did notice, however, a crystal amulet in the form of an hourglass hanging on a silver chain around his neck. What is that? A charm memory? I didn't know that Castor had a charm. Not wasting any time, the legacy put his bloodied hand on the statue and closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't wearing one back on the marble arch, right? Opening his eyes a second later, Castor glanced at Sonny with a dark expression and turned into a blur once again, rushing back to rejoin the battle. Just as soon as he disappeared, Sonny crashed into the stone pillar, unceremoniously using it to stop his momentum. Bouncing off the hard surface, he rolled on the ground and shakily rose to his feet. "Ugh! Damn it! That hurt!" That counted as touching the statue, right? Had to. Glancing back, Sonny saw another blood arrow piercing the flesh of the spire messenger and shattering a moment later. It wasn't destroyed, at least, just returned to Kai. Quiet Dancer was zipping around the massive abomination, aiming at its eyes. The elegant rapier was an echo, and as such did not enjoy the gift of the Dawn Shard, so it was more of a nuisance than a real threat to the beast. Still, it managed to deliver a couple of shallow cuts, causing the bastard to bleed. That was exactly what Sonny needed. Blood. As much blood as possible. Launching himself forward, he held the Midnight Sharp behind him and dashed toward the messenger. Let's see which one of us can kill it first, Caster. Wouldn't it be funny if an outskirt rat like me got a third ascended memory, while a lofty legacy like you still had none? Some distance away from his prey, Sonny commanded the Stone Saint to switch her battle style. The one the menacing shadow liked to use the most, or simply saw as most suited to her equipment and the situation, was deliberate, elegant, and steady. But that wasn't what Sonny needed right now. What he needed was carnage, savagery, and bloody mayhem. Lingering for a fraction of a second, the Stone Saint suddenly threw her shield away, grasped her sword with both hands, and lunged forward. Any sort of grace she had possessed earlier was now gone. Instead of a noble knight, the shadow now appeared as a barbarous butcher. It seemed as though she cared neither about self-preservation nor about protecting the members of the cohort anymore. She didn't even care about killing the enemy that much. All she aimed to do was inflict the maximum amount of pain, the maximum amount of damage, and, most importantly, the maximum amount of bleeding. Just like Sonny had commanded her to. As he ran back, more and more small but heavily bleeding wounds appeared on the messenger's massive frame. Its pale body was now half covered in dark blood, Caster's enchanted sword adding one or two, but most came from the Berserk Shadow and Changing Star. Effie was still in the fight as well, despite the fact that her arm was severely broken and there was bloody foam on her lips. The beautiful spear broke through the abomination's defenses and left a bloody mark on its skin too. But none of these attacks were powerful enough to end the creature once and for all. Already nearing the scene of the massacre, Sonny willed his shadow to flow on to the Midnight Shard. The power of the Dawn Shard was burning inside of it, making the stalwart blade sing. And on top of it all, the vile blood blossom was filling it with insatiable bloodlust and hunger. Without slowing down, Sonny lunged at the spire messenger, and fell on his back. As the momentum pushed him forward, he slid on the black sand and thrust the Midnight Shard upward. Piercing the abdomen of the terrible creature, the razor-sharp sword easily cut through skin and muscle, gutting the abomination and causing it to stagger and fall. Chapter 260. How to be a Hero. Indeed, with so much blood streaming down the messenger's pale body, the savage augmentation of the blood blossom had grown vastly more powerful. If before Sonny had felt as though he was cutting stone, now the Midnight Shard slides through the tough flesh of the abomination with just a moderate amount of trouble. Of course, the fact that it was aimed at the soft belly of the monster instead of the adamantine black feather also played its part. The Tachi cut through the pale skin and muscle tissue, tearing its abdomen apart. As blood, guts, and viscera fell from the terrible wound, Sonny slid from under the massive creature, just in time to avoid being crushed under its weight. Even then, however, the messenger was not yet dead. What? Curse it! Lying on his back in an awkward position, Sonny was momentarily left defenseless. He had hoped that his strike would, if not kill the monstrous abomination outright, then at least leave it stunned for a few seconds, giving him time to disengage and get away to a safe distance. But the creature seemed to be impervious to pain and the fear of death that all living beings felt. Despite receiving a mortal wound, it only became more ferocious. Staggered by the unexpected attack, the messenger lost balance and fell to the ground. Its head hit the black sand, sending a cloud of it into the air. Then, its round corvine eye locked onto Sunny and flushed with eerie madness. Knowing that he was not going to be fast enough, Sunny desperately tried to roll away. But it was too late. The terrifying jagged beak shot in his direction, threatening to impale him through the chest. Damn it, However, at the last moment, a human figure in an elegant black and white armor suddenly appeared between him and the abhorrent beast. The incandescent sword lashed out, pushing the beak slightly to the side. As the result, the messenger failed to kill Sunny. Instead, the beak pierced the Starlight Legion armor and tore through Changing Star's shoulder, almost severing her left arm. Nephis was thrown aside in a rain of blood, while the abomination opened its mouth and let out another deafening shriek. For a moment, time slowed. Sunny, who had just rose to one knee, noticed a sword surrounded by a ghostly green light approaching the messenger's neck. Castor was seconds away from finishing the cursed creature off. But before he got the chance, a heavy triangular dagger flashed in the air and sunk into the creature's eye, penetrating through it deep enough to reach the brain. The messenger froze. Its ugly raven-like head swayed slightly. The beak fell open, revealing rows of sharp teeth and a long, wet crimson tongue. Looking at the monster with a dark expression, Sunny pulled on the string of the prowling thorn, wreaking havoc inside its skull. The kunai tore through the round black eye on the way back, flying into the air in a stream of blood, bone, and chunks of brain matter. Finally, the creature convulsed and crashed onto the ground. Its eyes dimmed, then glossed over. The corner of Sunny's mouth curled upward. "You have slain a fallen monster, cursed herald. Your shadow grows stronger." "Come on." "You have received a memory." A triumphant gleam appeared in his dark eyes. The cohort was in a pathetic state. Effie had the bones in her arms shattered into tiny pieces, with sharp splinters tearing through her skin. Her ribs and lungs were wounded, too. Castor was bleeding heavily from the 4 gashes left on his torso by the messenger's claws. Kai lost too much blood to the blood arrow and was now on the verge of fainting. Neff's left arm was partially severed and barely attached to her body. The sight of it was ghastly. Even the stone saint was severely damaged. Only Sunny and Cassie were more or less in one piece. It was all worth it, though. The spire messenger was actually dead, while they were not. Lying on the black sand, Effie suddenly laughed. Sunny gave her a strange look. "Have you lost your mind? What are you laughing at?" The hunter shrugged, then grimaced from pain. "Oh, it's just... I was thinking whether we are legendary heroes now, or just, fools of legendary proportions. All of us in the outer settlement, the castle too, I guess, heard the stories about the incredible exploits of the first cohort hundreds of times. Killing a spire messenger who made its nest in the throne room, and all that. I never once thought that I would actually do something that impossible as well." She grew silent, and then added, "It's weird." Sunny sort of understood her feelings. However, he wasn't going to admit it. He didn't want his name to ever appear in the same sentence as the word hero. After everything he had experienced, Sunny had become allergic to it. He sighed. "You do know how one becomes a mythical hero, right? It's really easy. You just have to do something outlandish and then die. The death part is the key, actually. So I would rather not be a hero. Ever." With that, he stood up and tiredly dismissed his battle memories and the Stone Saint. Since only Cassie and he were unscathed, it fell to them to help everyone treat their wounds. Well, in this case, they just had to make sure that no one died before Neff summoned her flames and healed everyone. Sunny wasn't sure that she'll be able to remain conscious after that, though. Walking over to their leader, he sat down, looked at her, and then asked, "Are you stupid? Why did you do that?" She glanced at him with her usual indifferent expression, straightened her back, and said, "What do you mean?" Sunny sighed. "Why did you get between me and the messenger? Look at the state you're in." She looked at him, then shrugged with one shoulder. "I can heal myself, remember? You can't." He shook his head. "I also remember that my armor is 3 whole tiers above yours. Chances are I wouldn't even be wounded that terribly." Nephis was silent for a bit. Then she simply said, "Too risky." Sunny couldn't help but laugh. "Gods, I just don't get you. I really don't. You are so morbidly cunning sometimes, but other times you're so stupidly naive, it doesn't make any sense." Changing Star did not respond for a long time, and just stared at him. When she responded, her tone was as flat as usual. "Right back at you." Chapter 261. Moonlight Shard. Sometime later, Sunny found the time to dive into the Soul Sea and take a look at the new memory he had gotten. It was a heavy round shield, forged from dull, lusterless dark steel. Inside of it, visible only to him, a complex weave of ethereal strings shone with stark radiance. Memory. Dusk Shard. Memory rank. Ascended. Memory tier. 2. Memory type. Weapon. Memory description. Forged from a shard of a fallen star, this shield contains the weight of the heavens. Depending on the heart of its wielder, it can be light as a feather or heavy as regret. Memory enchantments. Indomitable. Enchantment description. Following the will of its master, the dusk shard can change its weight. Sunny frowned. This enchantment. At first glance, it seemed very unassuming. People usually thought about the weight of their weapons only when they considered how much endurance they would need to wield them. In that regard, the lighter the weapon was, the better. A light weapon could allow a person to fight longer without growing tired, which often meant the difference between victory and defeat. However, things changed when it came to the Awakened, who often possessed inhuman strength and endurance. Light weapons had their role to play, but more often than not, what you really needed was force. And the more mass something had, the more force it could produce. In the past, Sunny had only considered shields as a defensive tool, but after watching Effie and Stone Saint use them in battle, he realized that in the hands of a trained warrior, a shield could be as destructive and deadly as a sword, sometimes much more so. Just imagining Effie bashing someone with a shield that weighed 100 kilograms sent shivers down his spine. Not to mention that the weight could be changed on the fly, making it light to maneuver faster, and then turning into an improvised siege ram at the right moment. But even in terms of pure defense, a shield that could be turned into a literal wall was priceless. He could see monsters such as the Spire Messenger colliding with it, and simply bouncing off in the chorus of shattering bones. Maybe. Granted, Sunny never trained with the shield, and the sword he used demanded 2 hands to be wielded properly. But where there was a will, there would be a way. With a slight smile, Sunny summoned the Dusk Shard. The sparks of light appeared in a whirlwind around his arm. A few long seconds later, the silhouette of a large, round shield weaved itself into reality. After a few more seconds, and the memory was fully formed. "How not... Oh, crap!" With a surprised yelp, Sunny staggered and toppled over. Luckily, he fell on top of the dull iron shield, Otherwise, he might have been crushed under its weight. This is so heavy! The damn thing was heavier than he had ever expected. In fact, it was probably too heavy for him to even lift, let alone carry around. The members of the cohort glanced at Sunny, who was struggling to stand up, with perplexed expressions. Gritting his teeth, Sunny rose to one knee and awkwardly tried to lift the shield off the ground. However, no matter how hard he tried, he only managed to drag it by a few centimeters. Curses! All right, I admit it. It's too damn heavy. Let's reduce the weight a little. But a few seconds later, his face froze. This can't be. No way! However, the truth was hard to deny. He couldn't change the Dusk Shard's weight at all. The enchantment that was supposed to allow Sunny to do that was there, but it required him to actively manipulate the Soul Essence, Shadow Essence in his case, to access it. The most powerful enchantments were all like that, and the higher a memory rank, the more probable it was for the enchantments it possessed to be really powerful. The problem was that sleepers had no way to control and manipulate their soul essence. Sunny didn't know whether to laugh or cry. What were the chances of him coming to possess not one, not two, but 3 whole ascended memories? Only to find out that 2 of them were completely unusable, while the third one required him to somehow become a master marksman to avoid dying from blood loss. Damn it all! But especially damn that damn fated attribute! While Sunny was grinding his teeth in outrage, Effie approached him and glanced down from her considerable height. Then she leaned forward, took the Dusk Shard by the rim, and lifted it, along with Sunny, from the ground, seemingly without too much strain. And that's it then? The memory you got from the pale bastard? Finally standing up with the help of the Huntress, he stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he suddenly smiled. Yes. By the way, Effie, we're friends, aren't we? See, I couldn't help but notice that your shield memory was destroyed in that last fight. How about... She rolled her eyes. Wait, don't tell me. Sunny's shady emporium is open for business again? He blinked a couple of times, then grinned. Why, yes. How did you know? The Huntress glanced down at the heavy shield, squinted, and said in a cautious tone. Well, what did you want in exchange? Sunny thought for a bit. That bottomless bag of yours, and 2 other awakened memories. Before Effie could come to a decision, though, Nephis interrupted their conversation. Coming closer, she glanced at the Huntress first, then at Sunny, and finally at the shield. Finally, she asked, How about giving it to Effie in exchange for another ascended memory, one more suited to your technique? Sunny dismissed the Dusk Shard and hesitated for a bit, looking at Changing Star with doubt. Was this her ploy to get the shard memory from him? If she had an ascended memory all this time, why had she been hiding it? And where could she have gotten one to begin with? After a while, he said, I don't know. Show me the memory, and then we'll decide. Nephis silently stepped closer and took his hand. Then a spark of energy traveled from her body to his. The spell whispered, You have received a memory. Throwing a dubious glance at Nephis, Sunny summoned the runes and found the name of the memory he had received. His shadow tilted its head, surprised. Shimmering in the air in front of him, a string of runes read, Memory, Moonlight Shard. Chapter 262. Path to Damnation. Another shard memory? Sunny raised an eyebrow, glanced at Nephis, and turned back to the runes. His eyes glistened. Memory, Moonlight Shard. Memory rank, Ascended. Memory tier, 1. Memory type, Weapon. Memory description. When the stars were extinguished and fell, A lonely moon remained in the empty sky. With no sun to shine upon it, the moon grew dim, withered, and died. As the last remnants of moonlight were devoured by darkness, one small shard was forged into this subtle blade. Memory enchantments unseen. Enchantment description. Forged for moonlight, this blade appears in the hand of its wielder without delay. Sunny's pupils widened slightly. With a tense frown, he summoned the moonlight shard. A graceful dagger with a long and slender blade appeared in his hand. It was tapered to a needle-like point and had a simple crossguard, with a handle made from glossy black wood. The most striking feature of the dagger was that it seemed to be forged out of clear, misty glass. That glass, however, appeared to be as strong as steel, and much, much sharper. In the darkness of the underground cavern, the ghostly stiletto was nearly invisible. What really stunned Sunny, though, was not its look or its rank, but the fact that the moonlight blade had appeared in his hand instantaneously. There had been no sparks of light, no process of weaving itself into existence from nothingness. The dagger was suddenly simply there, as if it had always been that way. This was an incredible enchantment. It might not have seemed that powerful, but Sunny instantly understood that there was a lot more to this simple trait than most people would assume. Once summoned, memories took time to form. The dusk shard had weaved itself into existence in about 6 to 8 seconds, but even if it was just a single second, like the time it took Neff's silver sword to appear, the process was still not instantaneous. What's more, the appearance of a memory was telegraphed in advance by the dancing sparks of light. In short, it was very hard to take the enemy by surprise by suddenly summoning a memory. A skilled opponent would have had enough time to notice it and react accordingly, unless they were lured into a cunning trap by a sword savant like Changing Star. But even then, it wasn't easy to plan and execute such a move. Yet all of that didn't apply to the moonlight shard. The slender blade of the ghostly dagger could appear out of nowhere in an instant and immediately strike at the target. What an insidious little thing. It was uniquely suited to Sunny's preferred method of engaging the enemy, indeed. He liked to strike from the shadows and kill with one strike. With the ghostly blade in his arsenal, though, he would not even have to hide in the darkness in order to deliver an unexpected and deadly blow. No one would see it coming. Not to mention that it was an ascended memory. Armed with the moonlight shard, Sunny would finally be able to wound and kill fallen creatures, even without the miraculous enhancement of the Crown of Dawn. His own shadow would be more than enough. Granted, he would have to get really close and personal to a monster in order to use the dagger, but still, at least with it, he stood a chance. Suppressing a satisfied smile from appearing on his lips, Sunny turned to Nephis and asked in an incredulous tone, "Where did you get this thing?" She lingered for a few moments, then said, "North of the Dark City." Sunny nodded. That made sense. There was another red cross on her map, about a week's worth of traveling time north of the ruins. It was drawn near a symbol resembling a grotesque, misshapen skull. Changing Star had indeed been busy in the 3 months that he had spent hunting monsters in the dark streets of the cursed city. Now, 5 of the shard memories were accounted for: Dawn Shard, Zenith Shard, Dusk Shard, Midnight Shard, and Moonlight Shard. Only 2 remained. Sunny wondered which statue they were tied to, and whether someone out there already held them in their hands. It didn't matter that much for now, though. With a sigh, he dismissed the ghostly dagger and said, "I have to warn you that the enchantment on that shield requires an awakened to activate it. It is supposed to be able to change its weight and mass freely, but actually it's just stuck to being stupidly heavy." Nephis glanced at Effie, who just shrugged. I'm fine with it as it is. Sonny finally allowed himself to smile. Ah, that's great then. We have a deal. In the end, they had to spend a couple of days in the vast underground cavern. Nephis had to recover from her ghastly wound and the strain of healing the rest of the cohort, while all of them had not liked the idea of venturing back into the mist with their memories damaged. Eventually, though, they were ready to head back. Sonny used this short moment of respite to rest and practice shadow dance, slowly moving toward his goal of mastering its first step. He knew that there was nothing but bloodshed ahead of them. First, they would have to fight their way through the untold horrors of the labyrinth. And once they reached the Dark City, the last act of this messed up play would begin. Looking back, he couldn't believe how far he had come in these past 8 months. When Sonny arrived on the Forgotten Shore, he was weak and inexperienced. His first fight against a single carapace scavenger almost cost him his life. And now, here he was, standing near the corpse of a fallen monster he had killed with his own 2 hands. From barely killing a single carapace scavenger, to almost losing his life in a fight against a carapace centurion, to summoning a horror of the depths and finishing off the carapace demon. From entering the Dark City, not knowing anything about it, to hunting down dozens of nightmare creatures on its cursed streets, to fighting against a horde of undead monsters in the catacombs beneath it. From venturing back into the labyrinth of his own free will and waging war against a tribe of monstrous spiders, to riding on the shoulder of an ancient giant and battling fallen abominations and hordes of awakened creatures. From finding a nameless grave in the foothills of the Hollow Mountains, to witnessing the last resting place of the First Lord in their depths. He had lived through so much, endured so much, and accomplished so much. Of course, there had not been only victories. He had tasted defeat too. A lot of it. Both in battle and in his tentative attempts to build human relationships with the other prisoners in this desolate hell. He had experienced pain, sorrow, and despair. And he was going to taste even more of it soon. Turning his head slightly, Sonny looked at his companions. Nephis, Cassie, Kai, Effie, and Castor were busy with final preparations of their long journey. How many of them would be alive by the end of all of this? Closing his eyes, he sighed. It was not going to be easy to survive the finale. But Sonny was determined to show the rest of the world what he was really made of. He was going to win. He was going to be the last one standing. No matter what he had to do. Even if doing it would break him.